give me a shout if I call your name. Olivia Floyd, Anna Salgado, Antonia White, Ashley Bennett, Vita Johnson, Brianna Knight, Chance, Christopher Simmons, Christian Torres, Deja, Damalola, Destiny, Garrett, Guy, Hayden, Irving, Jessica, John Nguyen, John Winborn, Jordan, Jordan D, Joseph Yoon, Joshua, Catherine, Kiosha, Kenny, Kimberly, Kasaya, Kurt, thank you, Latavia, Lauren, Maja, Malcolm, Matthew, Montez, Maya Grant, Maya Ziegler, Nayan, Natalie, Nikki, Patrick, Paul, Precious, Rachel, Raven, Raquel, Rolanda, Rami, Ridu, Rosaline, Ruth, Sabi, Sienna Sierra, Solvi Suha, Tajan, Taylor Anderson, Teresa, Vanessa, Viet Wendy, William B. All right.
Yeah.
What's your name?
Guy Mark.
We'll do it again at the end, but okay, gotcha.
We don't have time for this, so whatever you have to do, you can do. But we're starting class, so I'm sorry. I don't mean to be rude, but I guess I'm going to be.
Okay, so just to put this in a little bit of context, where we left off last time was a long section where we were looking at how courts balance rights of free press versus other rights. You guys remember they called it an ad hoc balancing of interests, and they use the term strict scrutiny, which means they have to show a definite harm to an interest besides freedom of the press, and then they have to give the best alternative way to communicate if they're going to stop another kind of communication. So the example I used is if some group wants to protest in class during our class, GSU would say no, and if it went to the Supreme Court would say no, and they would have expected GSU to give them a good alternative, which probably would have been to protest in the little courtyard out here. And so we looked at a few different examples. We looked at the First Amendment versus the Sixth Amendment. That was the trial for the guy whose kid died in the back of the car. And the problem there was so much press activity about the case, they had trouble seating a jury, and they had to move the case to another county 200 miles away. We talked about the Pentagon Papers. I think the last thing we did, if my sources are correct, is we watched the trailer for the Post film. And so now, instead of me explaining it, we're just going to watch this video from the History Channel that explains some of the details. So what you're going to want to know about this video is kind of what's the story. So the basic story is there was internal classified research done about the U.S.'s involvement in the Vietnam War, and the person who was heading up the research leaked it, and New York Times, Washington Post were going to publish it, and at first a federal court stopped them, but then ultimately the Supreme Court said there was no national interest in blocking the publication of the Pentagon Papers. All right, but this is going to give you a much more interesting version of it than I just gave.
The New York Times published a report that would change history. Their source was Daniel Ellsberg, a military analyst working for the government, and the report, which would soon become known as the Pentagon Papers, included top-secret and incriminating information about the Vietnam War. Between 1967 and 1969, Ellsberg worked on a classified project for the government called United States-Vietnam Relations, 1945-1967, a study prepared by the Department of Defense. The Pentagon Papers were not a good look for the United States government. Ellsberg research showed that there were many military miscalculations and even flat-out lies told by politicians about U.S. involvement in Vietnam. But why did Ellsberg decide to leak the papers to the New York Times? While working on the project, he realized he no longer supported the Vietnam War and thought it was unwinnable. In October of 1969, concerned that the public was being lied to, he began photocopying the report. He leaked some documents to members of Congress, but none of them went public. So in 1970, Ellsberg leaked portions to the New York Times and the Washington Post. The Pentagon Papers revealed that the government had been involved in Vietnam through several presidencies, unbeknownst to the American people. As early as 1950, the Truman administration gave military aid to France against the Vietnam. In 1954, President Eisenhower sent aircraft and military assistance to Vietnam. By that time, the U.S. was covering 80% of France's military expenses in Indochina. President Kennedy adopted a policy of broad commitment to the war in Vietnam, even though the American people had been told U.S. involvement would be very limited. Then, President Lyndon B. Johnson waged military operations against North Vietnam. He began planning war in 1964, a full year before the depth of U.S. involvement was revealed to the public. In 1971, when the New York Times broke the story, President Nixon quickly obtained a court injunction from a federal judge in New York, stopping the Times from printing any more articles. He argued that publishing the Pentagon Papers would limit the president's ability to guard national security. The Times adhered to the restraining order, but they filed an appeal. Meanwhile, Katharine Graham, head of the Washington Post, started publishing articles about the Pentagon Papers instead. Nixon tried to stop the Post as well, but unlike the judge in New York, the D.C. judge refused to issue an injunction. This allowed the Post to continue publishing about the secret report. The inconsistency between the Post and Times cases quickly brought both papers to trial in the Supreme Court. The court decided that under the freedom of press, the government did not have a strong enough case to censor the press. Nixon lost the fight, and the articles were printed. Ellsberg was still indicted under the Espionage Act for leaking government secrets. He could have been sentenced to 115 years in prison, but the charges were dropped after evidence of governmental misconduct came to light. Although the Pentagon Papers did not include any details on Nixon's conduct in Vietnam, the president was embarrassed by the publications. He subsequently sought to discredit Ellsberg by using a team he called plumbers. They broke into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office to try to uncover embarrassing or harmful information that might make Ellsberg look bad. This was the same group of burglars who'd become famous for their role in the Watergate scandal. It didn't work. Ellsberg was free, and together with the New York Times, set a new precedent for the press, a responsibility to tell the truth, even if it means publishing classified documents.
Okay, so that tells the story pretty well, and the part we want to focus on is, in this case, the Supreme Court decided these reports about historical events. So the report basically said we were involved in Vietnam longer than the government let us know, and it was all historical data that was deemed confidential, the Supreme Court decided that didn't hurt national security. So knowing that previous administrations lied to the people was something that could be published and was protected by the First Amendment. Okay, so now this is the other main case involving prior restraint. And in the case of the Pentagon Papers, the New York Times was restrained from publishing something before they published it. And this is another case like that called the Progressive. And we're just going to listen to this video for the details of that case.
The question has been, first of all, under what circumstances are prior restraints ever possible? And there are some people that say, under the broadest reading of the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, means at a minimum the government can't stop you from publishing. That goes back to the English practice of having censors, and at one point you had to actually have the government approve something that you published, typically written things. The leading case for a long time came up in the 1930s, and the Supreme Court said in very, very narrow circumstances can there be a prior restraint. And that involved, and this is the exact language, no one would question but that a government during actual war might prevent actual obstruction to its recruiting service or the publication of the sailing dates of troops and transports or the number and location of troops. On similar grounds, the primary requirements of decency may be enforced against obscene publications.
Okay, so that's the first case that we looked at last time, Neer versus Minnesota. The press does not have the right to publish the location of troops and the other things he just read there.
So that's the question. What fits into that category of speech that impacts essentially national security? And that's the question of the Progressive case. The other relevant precedent involves the publication of what's called the Pentagon Papers cases, and with a vast trove of confidential information gathered that critiqued the handling of the Vietnam War. And the New York Times, the Washington Post, and some other people had copies of these many pages that were very critical about U.S. decisions, and they were internal documents, government officials criticizing the decisions of their own government. And so the Department of Justice went to try and get a prior restraint from publication of those papers. And the government argued this is the kind of situation, national security, that justifies the really unusual sanction of a prior restraint. The Supreme Court said, no, this is mostly historical data about a war that was fought a couple of years ago and events that have happened in the past. And even though it might be embarrassing to the government, that's not the same thing as national security. So those are the two cases that were in front of the judge in the Progressive magazine case. They typically don't work, even if they're legal and they're granted, the information still tends to get out in the public anyway. And that's what happened in the Progressive case. While the Seventh Circuit was considering the appeal, a Wisconsin newspaper and a Chicago newspaper and a California newspaper all threatened to publish it anyway. And they weren't in front of the court, so they wouldn't be in contempt of court if they published it. And so rather than go track down every person that had a copy of this article, the government gave up its appeal. And
okay, I forgot he didn't say what the actual case was. All right, a couple of things to get us back up to speed. First, one thing the Supreme Court does, we haven't talked about this yet, when there's a case before them, they look at previous cases that set what's called a precedent. So if the Supreme Court has already ruled on this issue, they will analyze those old rulings to figure out how should they decide in this case. And if there are no Supreme Court rulings, then they'll look at federal courts. So they'll look at previous rulings to decide, is there a legal precedent for how to handle this case? So in the case we're talking about now, prior restraint, Neer versus Minnesota established the precedent. And that was that essentially it was only in times of war for national security, movement of troops, location of troops, recruiting services. And then the Pentagon Papers case comes up and the court decides, even though the Pentagon Paper publication is embarrassing, it's not a matter of national security, so the newspapers can publish the Pentagon Papers. In this case, a magazine, The Progressive, was going to publish instructions for how to make a bomb. And essentially what happened is they were stopped from publishing those instructions, but in the end, the court ruled that this was not an okay situation of prior restraint because, one, all of these instructions were already available in books that you could get at the library. So they were essentially publishing something in a magazine that you could already get someplace else. And two, once the other papers, as he mentions here, once the other papers publish that same information, then it's out in the public domain and there's no reason to restrain anybody else from publishing it. So it was almost like once they realized the information was available someplace else and these other outlets published it, they just decided that prior restraint was not valid. Okay, so now another example of courts weighing the right to First Amendment protections versus something else is libel. And libel is defamation in written form. So some of you may be familiar with libel and slander. Slander is defamation through speech. So, for example, if I start talking smack about the president of GSU in class, that could be slander. If I publish a blog post saying the exact same thing, that would be libel. So, libel occurs in writing or any place essentially where the speech is permanent. So, a television broadcast, a radio show, anything that could be recorded would be libel. Anything that's spoken but not. So the difference is if I publish something in a newspaper, the paper is there, the physical evidence is there. In libel cases, they would rely on all of you to say what I said about the president of GSU. So libel is defamation of character in written form, and it's essentially a false statement. That's the first piece. That holds a person up to ridicule, contempt, hatred, or injures their business interests. Does anybody watch Judge Judy or the People's Court? Maybe y'all are in class in the morning. But if you ever stay home from class at 11 a.m. on channel 69, at least that's what we get at our house, the People's Court comes on, and every once in a while there will be a case where part of it is a person publishes negative information on the internet about the other side's business. So maybe it's a hair salon and the woman put the braids in too tight or whatever, and so the plaintiff publishes stuff on the internet saying that the hair salon is bad, don't go to them. And that would be a case, if it was false and if it hurt their business, then that would be a case of libel. Okay, so we've got the concept of libel. And now these are a couple Supreme Court cases that helped establish the precedent for what libel actually is. So New York Times versus Sullivan, one of the most important things they did is they distinguished libel against a private individual and libel against a public official. And from everything we've learned so far, you would expect libel against public officials would be held to a less strict scrutiny. Libel against individuals is held to a higher level of scrutiny. So in the case of private individuals, like if you all libeled me, I'm not a public figure. Public figures are like mayors, congresspeople, governors, police officers. But if you libeled me, the case would ask, A, is what you said false? And truth is always a defense against libel. So if what you said or published was true, there's no case of libel. Second, were there damages? So let's say, for example, somebody in here started writing negative things about me on a blog. It got back to my boss, and they said they couldn't hire me to teach at GSU anymore. those would be damages. So if I could show what you published was false and that I had damages, I would be on the right case. And then the third part is that it would have to be you being negligent in pursuit of the truth. And that just basically means that if you had ignored something that contradicted your story. Like, for example, let's say you said, Professor Harrow never showed up for class. When he did, he always started late and ended early, and he grades unfairly. And then you're about to publish this on your blog, and your roommate says, you shouldn't publish that because none of that is true. Even if you don't think the exams are fair, he's always there. He starts on time. He goes the full time. So you're basically you're negligibly ignoring their advice, then that would be libel. For public officials, they have to prove everything we just talked about that private officials have to prove, not approve. And they also have to show that they actually knew the information was false. So if the press publishes something, let's use the Brett Kavanaugh situation we're dealing with right now. If the New York Times publishes a story that they know is false, and it's not just that it is false and it can be proved later, but they know it's false, that's the first test. And then the second part is they have to have reckless disregard. So negligence in pursuit of the truth isn't as bad as reckless disregard. So this is where they didn't care. They were trying to sell newspapers. They were trying to get Kavanaugh off the Supreme Court, out of the nomination process. And so they recklessly lied, and they knew it. And then obviously there would be damages there. So the main thing is that public officials are held to a higher standard of scrutiny because the press has to, it's part of their job, to watch out for governors and the mayor, etc., and publish stories when they're doing something they shouldn't be doing. And for private individuals, we don't have the same level of scrutiny because we're just normal people going about our everyday lives. Okay, so what are the defenses against libel? If you end up on Judge Judy and you made 15 Yelp accounts and you use those accounts to say that Willie's right here has rats and they serve dog meat and all these lies, what are your defenses against libel? The first one, as I said, is the truth. So, if you can prove that what you said is true, that's one defense against libel. Another one, I'm going to skip down a little bit through the bullet points here. Another one is that especially for private individuals, if it's your opinion, then it can't be true or false. So if I publish something saying the food was horrible, that's my opinion and there's no false or trueness of that story. How many of you think Willie's is the bomb? Like delicious? Okay, I got some hands. Does anybody think it's bad? Okay, thank you for raising your hand. And so in that case, it's a balancing of opinions, so there's no libel there because there's no truth or falsity to the situation. Okay, a couple of other things. We realized really quickly that prosecutors have to be immune from libel so they can charge suspects with crimes. So prosecutors cannot be charged with libel if they charge you with murder and you're found not guilty, because then what would prosecutors ever do? So in order to allow prosecutors to do their job in criminal trials, they have absolute privilege, which means that they cannot libel you by charging you with a crime. And as some of you know, if you watch like Law and Order, they usually have to have some kind of corroborating evidence before they can arrest people and charge people with crimes. So prosecutors have absolute privilege. And then reporters have what's called qualified privilege. When they report about what happens in court, they can't be charged with libel either. So if a prosecutor charges you with murder, that's not libel if you were found innocent. And if a newspaper reports that a prosecutor charged you with murder and then you were found innocent, the reporter isn't guilty of libel either. So the reporters are allowed to tell what happened in court. As I said, opinion and fair comment are covered. So editorials in newspaper that favor Trump, that are against Trump, that favor confirming Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court, that are against it, those are opinion and comment, so those are not subject of libel. But what's kind of interesting about this, going back to the fake news section that we studied, one of the people that's coming up talking about libel is Donald Trump. And it kind of goes along with the fake news thing. So on the one hand, we've already established pretty much when he doesn't like a news story, he calls it fake news. And the other thing he's been doing is he's been talking about how the libel laws need to be strengthened so that people like him can sue the newspaper for publishing fake news. Now, I don't remember if I've got any Trump video on this. It doesn't look like it. Okay, so here's the tweet. And this is a recent one. This is September 5th. But some of you might remember there was a time, I think it was during the election or right after it, where he was on TV ranting about the same thing. Somebody had published a story about him, and he was complaining that the libel laws weren't strong enough. And this is an example of a response to the book Bob Woodward wrote about his administration. I don't know if y'all caught that, but he wrote a book critical of the president with a lot of inside sources saying a lot of inflammatory things about the president. And this was President Trump's response. And at the end there is kind of what I'm alluding to. Every time something like this comes up, one of the things he goes to is, we need to change libel laws to make it easier for people to sue somebody for libel. But we already know, and we don't have time to discuss it, and in this forum, discussion is kind of difficult anyway, but we know from the past few slides, there are standards for libel that are pretty solid, right? If something is true, it can't be libel. If something's an opinion, it can't be libel. It has to be false and reckless and misleading. And I don't know what other standards we would have for libel, but I think it's kind of interesting now we're seeing two things, attacks against the press is the way the press would call it, from our president. And if you want to fact check this story, you can go to politifact.com. That was one of the sources we learned about in the last section for fact-checking fake news. Okay, I think this is our last piece for today, and I know I just gave an example of me ending class early. Now it looks like we're going to end class early. Enjoy it. It doesn't happen very often. But we're not leaving, so don't start packing up. We've got a bunch of time, and actually I want to talk about the exam a little bit before we finish it up. But we've got one more First Amendment issue that I think will be interesting to some of you because we have a lot of creators in here. We have musicians, we have writers, we have artists, and so the issue of copyright I think is really important to a lot of people. And so let's take a look at this. This is another protection that is created regarding the First Amendment. Copyright gives the creator rights to control the thing they created. So if you write a song and copyright it, you have control over who can publish it and who can distribute it, and that's essentially what copyright does. It's an incentive for people to create original works of art. Do y'all remember when we studied newspapers, and one of the challenges for newspapers came when radio came out, and the people on the radio just started buying the newspaper for a quarter and reading the stories for their own content on the radio? So in a world where the newspaper is something that could be copyrighted, the newspaper company could have sued the radio station and stopped them from reading their news on the radio. So it's a similar thing. If you publish a song and it leaks and a radio station gets it and plays it, you have copyright protections over that. If we didn't have copyright, the idea is that artists would not be as interested in creating art because they want to profit off of it, or they don't want anybody to profit off of it, but there's no protection against that. So the example we're going to look at is copyrights and cover songs. So some of you know, a lot of times artists will take an original song and perform it. And one example I can think of, is Norah Jones does some Stevie Wonder songs. And actually Stevie Wonder is a very cover song person. So how does copyright work, and specifically in the case of cover songs, and that's the video we're going to watch now.
The exclusive rights are as to anything that one has created that has sufficient materiality, which is a low threshold. But anything you create, a song, a book, a statue, a picture, a painting, anything you create, copyright law gives you a limited monopoly over how that creation is used. The copyright law was enacted, if you think about it, there's the public policy. There's always a public policy when you have a law. Why are we making this law? And the public policy behind the whole copyright law is, well, we want people to invent things in our societies. That's been judged to be a good thing. We want songs, we want books, we want paintings, we want all these things. Well, how do you give incentive to people to create these things? And the copyright law says, okay, what we'll do is we'll give you a monopoly, with exceptions, a monopoly over how that creation is used. So it gives you, it enumerates 5 exclusive rights that the copyright holder has. That's the right.
Okay, so if you're thinking ahead for the exam, one obvious question would be about these 5 rights that copyright gives you. So as always, you can go back to the video and get a better set of notes about the list, but if you want to save yourself a little time, you might want to take notes on what the list of exceptions covers.
Right to reproduce the work.
Or what it gives them.
5 exclusive rights that the so it gives you, it enumerates 5 exclusive rights that the copyright holder has. That's the right to reproduce the work, the right to distribute the copies of the reproductions, the right to make derivative works, the right to public performance of the work, which would include television and radio performance of the work, and the right to publicly display the work, which doesn't have to do with music, but has to do with other things. Oh, there are always exceptions, like...
Okay, so let's stop for a second. The exclusive rights it grants you are pretty straightforward. You control the production. So let's say a song. You make a song and you copyright it. You can control who produces it. So you can control, in the example of, let's say, a single, like a 45, you have control over who can press the record. And if one vinyl record company presses it and gives your song to another company to press it, that's not allowed under copyright rules. So you can control who produces it, who distributes it, that means who sells it or who provides it. And some of you may know on YouTube, it used to be that if you put a popular song on, and I think Beyonce is one artist that has a team that really watches out for this. If you put a Beyonce song on YouTube, it used to be that it would get taken down fairly quickly because you violated her copyright. And what I know this in relation to is full albums. A lot of times people will put a full album on YouTube, and instead of taking it down, now what the copyright holder has the ability to do is essentially go to YouTube and claim that video as their own, so it stays on the person's YouTube channel, but every time somebody plays it, the copyright holder gets the credit for the clicks and the ads and stuff, not the person whose page it's on. So it's kind of interesting. If you have a copyright to something that's put on YouTube where people make money putting albums on YouTube so we can listen to them, you as the copyright holder put in a claim through YouTube and then you control it. One thing I wanted to mention, I can't remember the term she used, derivatives. Did anybody write that one down? One of the things she said is that your copyright allows you to make derivative works. And an example of a derivative work would be a remix. So the idea is, if you create a song, you have control over that song being remixed by other artists or producers. So if you want to remix the song, that's fine. If you want to give somebody else the rights, like maybe you're a hip-hop artist and you want to give the rights to a rock group to make like a edgy rock version of the song, you can do that. But under copyright protection, if I just take a song I really like and make a new mix for it, like what a lot of producers will do is they'll take an a cappella of a song and they'll put their own track under it. And that is something that a copyright holder could go after the artist. One last thing that I don't think she's going to mention here is obviously the internet makes it very difficult to protect some copyrights. If I do a version of your song and post it on my Instagram, how is it? The internet makes it much more difficult, especially if you disguise who you are in your account that publishes the thing that's copyrighted. So obviously the internet, social media, make it difficult. And the other thing is, does anybody go to like the little neighborhood stores where they've got the CDs and DVDs sitting on the counter? Then it's like $4.99 for the latest Lil Wayne CD. That is a violation of copyright, because what that is somebody took the audio files and put them on a CD, printed out the artwork if they were even that industrious, put it in a little jewel case, and sells it at the gas station. So that's another example. That's still, there's one right across from, I know this is going to sound bougie, our dog's daycare. Sometimes I stop in there. He's a puppy, so we send him to daycare sometimes. And there is a little like corner store, I would call it, across the street where they've got the latest movies. Almost as soon as the movie comes out, you can get it on DVD form in this gas station shop. Okay, so now she's going to talk about, it's been a long time since I watched this video, but I think she's going to talk about how cover songs are affected by copyright laws.
I always say to my students, any law can be written, most laws can be written on one page, and then the exceptions are the 300 pages following the one page. There are exceptions to the copyright law. For instance, some of them are historical and are interesting, but not really relevant. The big one that affects music and songwriters is the compulsory license provision, the compulsory mechanical license provision. Now, what's a mechanical license? A mechanical license is the right to reproduce the song in a sound recording. So anytime a song is put on a sound recording, a mechanical license must be obtained by the person recording the song. And that's called a mechanical license. So it has to do with records or recording. So the copyright law says, back to this public policy thing, well, we're giving the creator of the song this monopoly, but on the other hand, what we're trying to do is benefit society by these creations. So maybe this monopoly is a little too tight in this area. So the compromise is that once the songwriter or the copyright holder of the song has recorded the song and distributed copies of that song, of those recordings to the public, then anybody else can basically, in common vernacular, do a cover of the song. And that's the compulsory license provision. That's how I can record John Lennon, a John Lennon song, or a Coldplay song, or anybody else. The compulsory mechanical license does say, well, you can do it, but you got to pay the song copyright holder. So there's a thing called the minimum statutory rate. And right now that's 9.1 cents per song per record. So if I want to do a John Lennon tune, John Lennon's estate cannot stop me from doing anything that's already been recorded, provided that I pay to John Lennon's estate or whoever controls that publishing 9.1 cents for every copy I make of that sound recording. Although the copyright law, as you point out, is the background and the backbone of what happens. Most people don't go through the compulsory mechanical license provisions of the Copyright that the Copyright Act sets forth. Why? Because you got to send money to the Copyright Office every month, and then the songwriter has to get their money from the Copyright Office, and who wants to deal with the government, basically, and the bureaucracy. So over time, what has happened is that someone wishing to do a cover enters into an agreement directly with the publisher, and so there's a lot less paperwork, a lot more control for both parties. And often, when a mechanical license is given, the person I should say in relevant situations, the person who's asking for the mechanical license might be able to demand that rate be lower.
Okay, so those are some of the issues around copyright and cover songs. So if you want to do a cover song first, copyright doesn't stop you. But essentially, if the artist finds out, they can come after you for the money that they're owed. And one thing that's kind of related to this is sampling in hip-hop. So in hip-hop music, sampling has always been one of the ways they make tracks for artists to rap on. And it used to be that they would just steal the little pieces that they're sampling, but not pay the copyright money. And eventually, other artists figured this out, especially when hip-hop got really profitable. And now it's uncommon and pretty much doesn't happen that a major recording artist doesn't just go directly to the copyright holder and offer to pay them a certain amount to use a sample for a song or to cover a song. I actually lied. I forgot about, we've got one more section, but it won't take long. Then we'll talk about the exam. And this kind of goes back to the fake news, but also to journalism to kind of wrap up, because you remember in the beginning, essentially what I said is one of the reasons why I'm approaching this section of the class the way I am is I'm worried that journalism and the press are getting a bad reputation unfairly. And so a lot of what we've done is look at the importance of journalists, the importance of a free press. We've looked at the idea of fake news, and we see If we use the correct term, most things that are not favorable are not fake news. We know that mistakes are not fake news, and if a paper makes a mistake, they will publish a retraction. We know the influence of media ownership over something like a newspaper with the Sheldon Adelson case. So in the end, the last thing I wanted to do was focus on a part of the book that shows you some of the ethical rules newspapers and other journalistic outlets follow when they're making a story. Okay, so your book talks about applied ethics, which is where practitioners, newspaper reporters, bloggers, television anchors who do the news, they apply rules and standards to the work that they do. And as I mentioned before, we didn't look at this when I mentioned it before, and maybe this section should be moved someplace else, but every newspaper, like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, conservative or liberal, whatever their leaning is, they have editorial policies that they follow. So, for example, broadcast news companies have a standards and practices department. So, those departments set the rules for what happens on, like, the broadcast news. And then if something goes wrong on the broadcast news, the standards and practice departments would look at it to decide, do we need to develop new rules for this? So, for example, one of the examples we looked at last time was the Sinclair example, where the parent company forced all of the local TV stations to read the same editorial. And a standards and practice department at a local TV station may look at that and the blowback they got and say, okay, we need to figure out, can we develop a better set of rules or guidelines for anchors to be able to deal with when we're told they have to read something they don't necessarily agree with. And the thing I wanted to focus on for a little bit, newspapers and magazines have policies for how they operate and how they write and publish stories. And so I just wanted to take a couple of minutes to look at a couple of editorial policies. Okay, so the first one is the Washington Post. Bear with me a second. Okay, so here's the Washington Post Policies and Standards page. And we'll just scroll down a little bit. Actually, let's scroll up a little bit here real quick. First of all, if you're interested in this, probably a lot of you are like, dude, calm down with all this stuff. But if you're interested in how newspapers guide themselves when they're publishing a story, you can go to this webpage and see their ethics policy, which we're going to look at in a second. And you can see their corrections policy. So one of the things we learn in fake news is when errors occur, a correction has to be published, and the Washington Post has a policy for that, and a policy on sources. So let's take a quick click through these. Okay, so here are some of the ethics policies. One ethics policy is conflict of interest. And this is kind of what we were talking about with the Las Vegas Review-Journal being owned by Sheldon Adelson brings up. In the case where the owner is the subject of the story reported, what conflicts of interest are there? And so there are rules about, for example, accepting gifts from news sources. So if you go to Washington, D.C. to report on a story and you have dinner with a source for your story they can't pay for your dinner because then it seems like they might be influencing what's written about you. So there are all these rules about what reporters can and cannot take, gifts and food and stuff, because we want the reporter to remain objective when they're looking at the facts and not be swayed by being given gifts. Okay, so let's see what else. Ethics. There's a fairness section. Okay, so let's go back up to the top. And go to the policy on sources. Because one of the things that we sort of talked about a little bit later is the use of confidential sources in a story and how that should work. Because one thing is, if you have a story written about you that's critical and all the sources are anonymous, I mean, usually we want to know who the source is so we can judge the information. And so you can see the Washington Post has guidelines on sources. They say they should be reluctant to let the source be anonymous, and it explains why. And so if you're more interested in this, you can go through and see how does the Washington Post decide when to publish anonymous sources, and what do they do to get to where they publish them. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is the use of anonymous sources. And as I said, and as we saw, every news outlet has these policies, but the NPR is a pretty good example of this kind of policy. Bear with me 1 second here. Okay, so here's the NPR talking about anonymous sources. So they have these guidelines, and what I like about this one is you can kind of see from the headline what the guideline is. So the first one is, don't let sources offer anonymous opinions of others. So this would be a very important in the case of the Bob Woodward book. Woodward wrote a book critical of Trump and the Trump administration, and he has a lot of anonymous sources that are giving opinions, for example, about the mental fitness of President Trump to be president. And the NPR has a policy on this. They say unidentified sources should be rarely heard and should never be heard attacking or praising others in our reports. NPR is a radio station, it's all audio. And so there's a policy that if somebody comes with a story to an editor at NPR that has an anonymous source attacking somebody in the story, they should go to this policy and say, we don't do that. Now, here's a question that I just want you to think about for a second. Let's say the reporter really thinks that anonymous information should stay in the story. How would the editor decide whether or not to keep it in? They would do a balancing of interests, just like we learned in the section a little bit earlier in yesterday. So they would look at what is the right of the reporter to use this information against what's the potential damage to having the anonymous source, and they would kind of weigh. So one thing that might matter is the importance of the story. If it's a story about a musician that's like not a big deal, maybe they would let it go. If it's a story about the president, because that's more important, they may say we can't include it if it's an anonymous opinion. Okay. Another example here is our word is binding. Let's see what this one is about. We don't want to reveal an identity of an anonymous source unless that person has consented. So this is the flip side. If they do go ahead and use an anonymous source in a story, and some of you may have seen movies about this, and this actually it doesn't come up in the post, but it comes up in other movies. If they use an anonymous source, reporters can decline to reveal the source, and so the NPR has a policy that generally they don't reveal anonymous sources when asked unless the source gives permission. And some of you may know reporters sometimes go to jail for not revealing the source of anonymous information. So if you're curious, if you're more curious about these types of policies, you can go down and see press anonymous sources hard. So if you're using an anonymous source, you question them more strongly than you would somebody who was on the record. And they have these don'ts: no attacks, no disguises, no offers. And then a supervisor decides if anonymous news is shared. So there's a lot more there if you're interested in it that would help you decide, is a news source credible or not? So in this case, so how do we use this information? Okay, so in this case, what you would do, let's say you're listening to an NPR story that uses an anonymous source and you don't remember this lecture. You go to the NPR, you look for their editorial guidelines, you're Googling it, you find it, and then you can read it and go, oh wow, they really have a high standard for using anonymous sources. Same thing with the New York Times. It's a little hard to find the New York Times editorial policies, but this is their editorial policy that they just published. When the lead of a story is based on one or more anonymous sources, they have to go to a specific person who will approve or deny it. Every other use of anonymous stories must be approved by the department head or the deputy. So you can see the rules for using anonymous sources at the New York Times. So for any newspaper at least, you can find out exactly what rules they follow for using anonymous sources. And hopefully seeing that these kind of rules exist make you feel a little bit better about trusting national newspapers. Of course, it's always easy to say, well, who enforces the rules? But there are standards of journalism that do kind of help us make sure we're getting good information. Okay, so that's it for the lecture. It's 9 o'clock. I guess I lied about leaving early. I'm sorry. I didn't do that on purpose. It's just a little bit of me being unprepared as opposed to lying. Sorry. But don't charge me with libel because it was a mistake that I just corrected. Okay. All right, so the last thing I want to do is talk a little bit about the exam. It will be open tomorrow by 5. I've got to write a bunch more questions. I thought it would be smart to wait to see what I did in here before I wrote questions for these parts of the exam. But I will publish the exam by tomorrow at 5. I'm hoping to have it done earlier. I'm hoping if I can have a good work session this afternoon, I might be able to put it out later today. If not, definitely by 5 tomorrow. It's one of my top work priorities. While you're listening, if you want to log in to the 9 o'clock lecture, I would appreciate that. So number one, the exam will be up by 5 o'clock tomorrow. It closes on Monday at 11:30 p.m. And a couple of things about the exam. One, obviously, one key thing is you need to figure out a way to take the exam on one computing device and have all your electronic materials available on the other. The exams are written assuming you're going to search through the book, assuming you're going to have notes on the video, assuming you might want to look at the PowerPoints. And so one thing I didn't think to even say last time because I forgot about the ebook, We never used an ebook before this, but obviously having your book on the computer and having the browser locked means you can't do both on the same computer. So I know that's a hardship, and I'm guessing most of you figured it out long before I did, but that's one thing. The other thing is the setup will be the same. So it's 50 questions, 65 minutes. You'll have 3 attempts, and the balance is similar. So we talked about the newspaper chapter for 1 lecture. We talked about the culture of journalism PDF for 2 lectures, and we talked about chapter 14 for 2 lectures. So there's going to be 20 questions from this chapter. Let me not go backwards. There's going to be 10 questions from chapter 4. There's going to be 20 questions from the culture of journalism PDF. There's going to be 20 questions from chapter 14. There will be questions about the lecture material I brought, the videos and other information I brought, and everything in the reading is fair game for questions. And the last thing I want to say is I noticed a very clear distinction where I can look at the your attempts and I can order them score-wise. So I notice as I'm going from the highest scores to the lowest that the attempts are spaced out farther. Everybody at the top with the highest scores took all 3 attempts. And as I go down into the 70s and lower, I notice lots of people only taking 1 or 2 attempts. I noticed 2 attempts that had to be back-to-back. You know, I can see that you took like 27 minutes to do a 50-question exam. So I really want to encourage you to plan when you're going to take the exam and then plan prep before and after it so that each attempt you can go back and prepare and see what you weren't able to find last time and really make the attempts valuable. People that take their first attempt at 9 o'clock on Monday night, I know you're busy, but that is not the strategy for success. So try to space it out. And then last thing before we take attendance, we have 10 minutes. I will be here Tuesday from 8 until 9. At 9 o'clock, if there are no students, I'll go to my office. If you come at 9, I'll stay until 9:15 and then go to my office. So if you manage to take an attempt on Wednesday or Thursday night, like I guess early morning, and you want to come talk to me, or if you just want to come talk to me before you take the first attempt, that's what Thursday is for. You're not required to come if you don't want or need to do that. And then next Tuesday, we start up with the chapter on films. Question?
I was asking if you meant Tuesday or Thursday.
Thursday, sorry. Yeah, Thursday we don't have class. And then Tuesday we come back for film and possibly a pop quiz. All right, so let's do this attendance one more time. This is looking good. And I've got to tell you, based on my experiences with this, I don't know if I'm going to go to it this semester, but I'm definitely, to me, to get extra credit for attendance, you should be here pretty close to the start, and you should stay until pretty close to the end. Now, it might be different